Hi. I apologize for my very brief hiatus. The Christmas season only seems to get busier year by year, but then doesn't everything. Today, I've selected to read The Road Past Altamont by Gabrielle Roy. Gabrielle Roy, very prolific French-Canadian author. Not Québécois. She Manitoban, actually. Which came as a surprise to me because I didn't realize that there was a sort of a French migration from Quebec to Manitoba. So it's definitely an interesting part of Canadian history that, having read this novel, it's sort of been revealed to me. That notwithstanding, so very short novel, just 4 chapters, each a sort of short story. They can either be read alone or in totality. I think they're best read in totality, but just to break up break it up into more videos so I can get more clicks out of you guys. I'm just gonna read them chapter by chapter. So, with that being said, let's begin. I was 6 years old when my mother sent me to spend part of the summer with my grandmother in her village in Manitoba. I balked slightly at going. My old grandmother frightened me a little. She was known to be so devoted to order, cleanliness, and discipline that you couldn't leave the tiniest thing lying about at her house. With her, it seemed, it was always pick up after yourself, put away your things as the twig is bent, and other admonitions of the sort. As well, nothing exasperated her so much as the tears of children, which she called mewling or caterwauling. That was another thing, her rather curious way of speaking, partly invented by herself and often far from easy to figure out. Later, however, I found several of my grandmother's expressions in my old litre, and realized they must date back to the time when the first settlers came to Canada from France. Yet she must have found time heavy on her hands, for it was her own idea that I should spend part of the summer in her company. "Send the little sickly one to me," she wrote, in a letter my mother showed me as proof that I would be welcome at grandmother's. Those words, "little sickly one," had already made me feel none too well disposed towards my grandmother, so it was in a more or less hostile frame of mind that I set out for her house one day in July. I told her so, moreover, the moment I set foot in her house. "I'm going to be bored here," I said. "I'm sure of it. It's written in the sky." I didn't know that this was precisely the sort of language to amuse and beguile her. Nothing irritated her as much as the hypocrisy that is natural to so many children. Wheedling and coaxing, she called it. So at my dark prediction I saw something that in itself was unusual enough. She was smiling faintly. "You'll see. You may not be as bored as all that," she said. "When I want to, when I really set my mind to it, I know 100 ways to keep a child amused." But, for all her proud words, it was she herself who was often bored. Almost no one came to see her anymore. She had swarms of grandchildren, but she seldom saw them, and her memory was failing, so it was difficult for her to tell one of them from another. From time to time, a car full of young people would slow down at the door, perhaps stop for an instant. A bevy of young girls would wave their hands, calling, "Hello, Mamelle, how are you?" Grandmother would just have time to run to the doorstep before the girls disappeared in a whirlwind of fine dust. Who were they, she would ask? Cleophas's daughters? Or Nicolas's? If only I had my spectacles, I would have recognized them. That, I would inform her, was Beth, Alice, Graziella, and Anne-Marie. "Ah," she would say, struggling to remember whether these particular girls were the daughters of Nicolas, of Cleophas, or of Alberic. The next moment she would begin to argue with herself. "But no, what am I thinking? Most of Nicolas's children are boys." She would go to sit for a moment in her rocking chair beside the window, to try to settle the matter once for all and make a complete inventory of her descendants. I loved seeing her like this, looking for all the world as if she were unraveling some skeins of tangled wool. "In Cleophas's family," she would begin, "there's Gertrude first, then the oldest son. Now what is that big dark boy's name? Is it Remy?" "No, indeed. Now let's see," I would answer, beginning to lose my patience. "Remy belongs to Uncle Nicolas." "Ah, you don't say," she would remark with a vexed look. But I noticed that little by little she became less troubled by my awareness of her infirmities, her dimming eyesight, her faulty hearings, and what was even more irritating to her, the failure of her memory. The following day another group of young people might descend upon us, this time by buggy, but only for 5 minutes. Grandmother would hurry to set the table, perhaps hoping to bribe them to stay, but nothing of the sort. The moment she had gone down to the cellar to fetch a pot of gherkins, the girls in their Sunday clothes would be caroling, "We can't wait, we're on our way to Rathwell. Bye-bye, ma mère." She would come up, blinking a little, and ask, "Have they gone?" From outside could be heard a great racket of departure. "Oh, these modern young people!" Grandmother would exclaim. We were alone in the little house, listening to the lamentations of the prairie wind as it writhed interminably in the sunlight, forming and reforming tiny rings of dust. Grandmother would begin to talk to herself, perhaps unaware that I was listening. One day I heard her sigh at the window. "You're always punished by the very things you thought you wanted." I probably wished too often for comfort, to have everything neat and tidy, and to be free of children clinging constantly to my skirts with their doleful wailing. I wanted just 1 minute to myself. Now I have a whole century to myself. She sighed again, then began to reproach God. Why does he listen to us when we ask for things that won't suit us when we get them? He ought to have sense enough not to listen. Then she remembered my presence in the house, and summoned me with a little gesture of the hand. "Well, at least I know your name." Then she asked, "And what is your name again?" "Christine," I told her with some annoyance. "Yes, that's so. I knew. Christiane." And, lost in her thoughts, she asked, "And how old is that little girl?" There was one time of day when I never failed to feel a sense of boredom and lassitude coming over me. This was the moment when the sun, just before it disappears, casts a great light over the red prairie. A remote, strange light that seems to extend its vastness and at the same time empty it of all human presence, as if giving it over to wild dreams of the time when it existed in utter solitude. It seemed then that the prairie wished to have no people, no houses, no villages upon itself, that it had tried with a single stroke to rid itself completely of all this and be once more as it was in the old days, proud and lonely. At grandmother's, moreover, there was no way to avoid this disturbing sight. The village was small and grandmother's house stood right at the end of it. The prairie surrounded us like the ocean on all sides except the east, where a few other little houses could be seen, our companions on what seemed to me a terrifying journey. For in the complete immobility of the prairie, one had the sense of being drawn forward on a sort of voyage across an endless land of everlasting sameness. Suddenly, understanding neither my sorrow nor its source, I burst into loud wails. "Oh, I'm so bored, so bored, so bored!" "Will you be still?" said grandmother irritably. "You make me think of a coyote howling at the moon." I tried to be still, but soon my strange sorrow, nameless with no cause that I could define, seized me again, and I howled more loudly than ever. "Oh, I'm so bored, so bored, so bored!" "Ah, the poor innocents," said grandmother. This was always her term for unhappy children, especially when they were in the depths of their inexplicable distress. She might have been alluding to the massacre of the blessed innocents, I do not know, but whenever she saw a child weeping bitterly, she would exclaim in an indignant voice, "Ah, the poor innocents!" In vain she offered me all the many good things to eat there were in the house, and finally, knowing no other way to distract and console me, she said, "If you'll just stop caterwauling, I'll make you a doll." Immediately, my tears stopped. I looked skeptically at my grandmother, seated in her high rocking chair. "You find dolls in stores," I said. "You don't make them." "That's what you think," she said, and began as usual to complain about stores and high prices and the present-day custom of buying everything ready-made. When she had vented her anger in this way, a little glimmer came into her eyes that I had never seen there before. It's quite extraordinary, like a light suddenly kindled in a place one had believed abandoned and overgrown. What she was going to accomplish today began, however, in the simplest way in the world. "Go to the attic," she said, "and fetch my big scrap bag. Don't make a mistake. Get the one that's tied on top with string. Bring it to me, and then you'll see whether I can make what I've a mind to make." Still incredulous, but curious too, and perhaps secretly hoping to catch grandmother napping, I went in search of the big scrap bag. From it, grandmother drew some bits of multicolored material, all clean and sweet-smelling. Grandmother's rags were all carefully washed before they were put away. Pieces of chintz, of gingham, and of dimity. I recognized, as was always in the way in her quilts, the remains of a dress that had belonged to one of my sisters, of a blouse of maman's, of one of my own dresses, and of an apron whose owner I could no longer remember. It was pleasant to be able to attach so many memories to these scraps. Finally, grandmother found a piece of white cloth. She cut this into several bits, from which she made what looked like a number of little bags of different shapes. One for the trunk, others for the arms and legs. Now I'll need some straw or salt or oats to stuff these with. It's up to you. Which would you prefer, she asked. A soft doll stuffed with straw or oats? I said. It will be heavy, grandmother warned. That won't matter. Very well then, go to the barn. There's a sack of oats there left over from the time I was thinking of keeping some hens. Fetch me a little dishful. When I came back, the various parts of the doll's body were all ready to be filled with the oats Mère had saved on the chance she might have some hens. I didn't fail to notice the way a number of odd combinations of events were all rushing today to serve my pleasure. Soon my grandmother had stitched the stuffed limbs and body together, and there before my eyes was a little human form, quite nicely made with feet, hands, and a head that was a trifle flat on top. I began to take a keen interest in the manufacture. But you'll be stumped for hair, I said. For hair? That's what you think, she said, enlivened by the discovery that the infinite and ingenious resources of her imagination, at least, were all intact. Imagination, you might say, was our family gift. Go back to the attic, she said. Open the right-hand drawer of the old chest I put up there. No rummaging, mind. Just take a skein of yarn. By the way, do you want one of those blonde dolls that are all the rage these days? Or a brunette? Or how about an old woman with white hair like me? I hesitated over the cruel choice. I felt a strong inclination toward an elderly doll with spectacles and white hair, thinking what a novel effect this would present, but I also greatly fancied a young lady doll. Could you make me one with blonde, curly hair? Nothing simpler, said grandmother. Bring the color of yarn that suits you, and on your way back fetch my curling iron from my room. Bring the oil lamp at the same time. No. On second thoughts, you won't break something. Do it in 2 trips. This I proceeded to do. Grandmother then made a lovely wig of yellow hair, waved it with her curling iron, and fitted it over my doll's head. I could no longer hide my astonishment. Do you know how to make everything? I asked. Almost everything, she said dreamily. Young people nowadays don't know the joy and pride of making do with what they have at hand. They toss everything out. And after a moment she went on. When I was young, I had to get along without buying things in stores. I learned. Oh, yes, I learned, she said, gazing far back into her life. But now your doll. She must have a face. Climb onto the table and see if you can stretch way up and snatch my pen and bottle of ink from the ledge. When I had brought her these things, she moistened her pen and drew on the still blank face of my doll the arcs of the eyebrows first, then eyes, mouth, and a completely straight, precise little nose. I began to clap my hands and to prance about with a joy I found it impossible to contain. No doubt it was the creative talent of my grandmother that delighted me so. Indeed, whenever I have seen this gift of God at work, even if it is possessed by the humblest creature, and it is to be found in astonishing places, it has always filled me with the keenest pleasure. Oh, but her mouth should be red, I said. That's so, said grandmother. That blue mouth gives her a peaked look. This may present a bit of a problem, but we'll manage. I noticed that she was beginning to associate me with her creative work. Now I felt prouder than ever of her talents. Go and look on the bureau in my room, she said with a flash of inspiration. See if there isn't a tube of that stuff they call lipstick. Atrocious stuff, real Indian war paint, but for once it will be of some use to us. It seems to me that Gertrude, no, I mean Anne-Marie, left some here the last time she went into my room to ditivate. I found just so, in the exact spot she had indicated, the Indian war paint. With this, grandmother drew the prettiest little red mouth, pursed just as a trifle as if in a vague smile. Curly-haired, a blonde with blue eyes, my doll seemed to me now with her rather mocking smile to be completely beautiful, though she was still stark naked. To dress her, said grandmother, I have some very nice curtain lace in the bottom drawer of the bureau in the guest room. Go and fetch it, and while you're at it, look in the top drawer too. I think you'll find some blue ribbon there. Half an hour later my doll was wearing a pretty white dress, trimmed with ruffles and sky-blue sash, and grandmother was busily stitching a row of minute blue buttons down the front of the dress. But she's barefoot, I said, suddenly in consternation. Shoes will be a little harder, eh, Mère? I was becoming humble, very humble indeed before her, before the grandeur of her mind, the deftness of her hands, the sense of exalted and mysterious solitude that surrounds all those who are busy with creation. Shoes, she said simply. Would you like them made of leather, or satin, or plush? Oh, of leather! Yes, it's more durable. Well then, go and fetch the yellow leather gloves that used to belong to your Uncle Nicolas. You'll find them. This time, too, under her directions, I put my hand without trouble on the yellow leather gloves. It's store leather, she said, turning them about and peering at them closely. Stores sell mostly rubbish, badly stitched, badly finished. For once, something handsome and of good quality has come from one of those places. Your Uncle Nicolas had extravagant taste in his youth, she confided. But it's true that he bought these gloves for his wedding. Now you see how everything can be of service more than once. Yesterday for a wedding, today for doll shoes. They say I keep everything, that I encumber myself, that I'm an old-fashioned old woman. But a day always comes when the things you tossed out the window might have been put to good use. While she was talking, she first cut out, then put together the most adorable little doll shoes I had ever seen. While I'm at it, she said, I might as well make her some gloves. Night came. Grandmother had me light the lamp and bring it close to her. Neither of us thought of the evening meal. The strict daily schedule to which my grandmother held so firmly for once had ceased to exist. So when something bigger than the timetable presented itself, she was quite able to ignore it. She went on working, her glasses on her nose, as happy, I am convinced, as in the days when urgent tasks claimed her from morning till night, leaving her, you might say, no moment's respite in which to scrutinize the vast enigmatic depths of fate. Or perhaps I should say happy with the completeness she knew only when her task transcended the bare requirements of the moment. Have you thought of a name for her? She asked, looking at me from under her spectacles. They were old spectacles with steel rims. Yes, Anastasie. Ah, she said, and I knew that the name pleased her. There was an Anastasie in my village in Quebec in the old days. It's a striking name, not like those little short modern names that you forget the very next minute. Jean, Robert. In the old days, people had names you could remember. Fidim, Viateur, Zoe, Sosten, Zachary. All this time, my doll was progressing. She didn't, it might be said, need anything else. But grandmother was undoubtedly too well launched by now to be able to stop. From some black cloth she fashioned a traveling cape. Then, one thing suggesting another, painstakingly set to work with cardboard and glue to make her little valise. To this she stitched a minute handle, which I slipped over Anastasie's hand. Even this wasn't enough. She must have a hat, grandmother declared. One doesn't go traveling without a hat, even in these shameless modern times. She sent me to fetch an old straw hat from behind the door of the vestibule. She unraveled it, then, working slowly with her rheumatism-stiffened fingers, with such fingers, she told me, it was much more difficult to work with small things than with large, she knitted a new, this time tiny, dainty hat. What? I cried, quite overcome. So you know how to make hats too? In the old days I made very pretty hats from the fine marsh straw not far from our house. Not only that, she told me, I have often dressed someone, your mother, your grandfather, from head to foot. From head to foot, ma mère? From head to foot, and without needing to go to the store for a single thing, except perhaps for buttons. And I've even made those out of ox-horn, with an awl to pierce the holes, I managed. From head to foot, I said. She held out my doll with her straw hat hanging from her neck by a ribbon. I was so happy that I burst into tears. Well, if we're going to have that again, I've done all of this for nothing, grandmother said in grumbling tones. But, forgetting how little she cared for effusiveness and caresses, I climbed onto her knees, flung my arms around her neck, and sobbed with a happiness that was too piercing and wide to bear, almost incredible. It seemed to me that there was no limit to the things this old woman with a face covered with 1,000 wrinkles could accomplish. A sense of grandeur, of infinite solitude came over me. You're like God, I wept into her ear. You're just like God. You can make things out of nothing, as He does. She pushed me away, but without too much exasperation or impatience. I'm far from being like God, she said. Do you think I'd know how to make a tree, a flower, a mountain? A flower, perhaps. She smiled a little. I've certainly made plenty of them grow. Nevertheless, I saw that she wasn't offended by my comparing her to God. For with such means and strength as He gave me, she said after a moment's reflection, I have aided Him not too badly in His creation. I have perhaps done all a human being could do. I have twice built a home, she told me. Having followed your trotting horse of a grandfather from one part of this vast country to another, I began all over again here in Manitoba what I'd already made back in Quebec. Made once for all, I thought, a home. That is work, she assured me. Yes, a house, a family. That's so much work that if you saw it before you all at once in a single heap, you'd think it was a high mountain. a mountain you couldn't possibly climb over. She realized that I was listening to her. Anastasia clutched against my heart, but perhaps thought it all passed over me. And indeed, most of it did, though I kept a little of it. That is what life is, if you want to know, she continued, and I no longer knew to whom she was speaking. A mountain made of housework. It's a good thing you don't see it at the outset. If you did, you mightn't risk it. You'd balk. But the mountain only shows itself as you climb it. Not only that, no matter how much housework you do in your life, just as much remains for those who come after you. Life is work that's never finished. And in spite of that, when you're shoved into a corner to rest, not knowing what to do with your 10 fingers, do you know what happens? She asked. And without waiting for an answer, told me. Well, you're bored to death. You may even miss the housework. Can you make anything out of that? No, I said. She seemed utterly astonished to discover me, all attention at her feet. Are you mad at someone? I asked. Mind your own business, she said. But an instant later, withdrawn again into her reveries, she named for me one by one all those who had so bitterly offended her. Your grandfather, Élisée. Such a trick to play on me, the gay adventurer. To go first without waiting for me, leaving me all alone on this western prairie, in exile. Manitoba is in exile, I said. It's home. All the rest of you too, she went on. You'll be just like the others. You're all like him. Independent, selfish, travelers, every one of you. You all have to be off somewhere. And God, too. Even he, in many ways, has forsaken me. Because truly, no matter what the priests say, no matter how hard they try to make reason and sense out of it, he allows too many strange, worrisome things to happen to us. She grumbled on so that I dozed, leaning against her knees, my doll in my arms, and saw my grandmother storm into paradise with a great many things to complain about. In my dream, God the Father, with his great beard and stern expression, yielded his place to grandmother, with her keen, shrewd, far-seeing eyes. From now on it would be she, seated in the clouds, who would take care of the world, set up wise and just laws. Now all would be well for the poor people on earth. For a long time I was haunted by the idea that it could not possibly be a man who made the world, but perhaps an old woman with extremely capable hands. Yet, a year or so later, my grandmother, powerful as she seemed to me, began to be a source of constant worry to my mother. Foolhardy as she is, said Maman, I just can't rest knowing she's alone in that little solitary house. She might fall while pulling up that trapdoor leading to her cellar, and lie there heaven knows how long with a broken hip before anyone noticed they hadn't seen her go out. I was astonished by this perpetual anxiety, for to me, I suppose, grandmother seemed indestructible. One day, it was a presentiment Maman had had. Another day a dream in which she had seen grandmother calling to her from the bottom of a well. Finally, one such morning, Maman got up firmly and decided to go that very day to bring her mother back to live with us. I was already rejoicing, thinking of the lovely dressmaking I would see as soon as grandmother was at our house. But Maman returned unsuccessful. Just imagine what I found her doing, she said as soon as she came in, still wearing her hat but already seated to tell us about her disappointment, so that she still seemed to be a visitor in her own house. When I think of it, at this time of year when the soil is still damp and cold, there she was in her field, her prairie she calls it, digging. I, for my part, didn't find this so terrible. Every year at this season, it was an undeniable fact that grandmother was to be seen turning the soil, and I suppose that this was because she liked to do it. Yes, indeed, said Maman, as if infuriated by the very thought. This year again she's undertaken a huge garden. Really, Maman, I asked her, do you consider it sensible for one solitary old woman to grow enough vegetables to feed a whole township? To this, grandmother had replied, as seemed to me quite in character, you may be happy to have some of my vegetables yourself. Then something else like, it's my own business, which Maman reported to us in grandmother's voice, slipping back into her own as she said, I think it's my business too. In this way, one could follow everything that had happened quite well, Maman having a talent for recounting animated discussions between 2 or 3 people. Just stop making yourself so anxious about me, Maman had told us her mother had said, to which she herself had replied, Ah, now I don't have to make myself anxious. I was so fond of such accounts in those days that I believe I was too interested to realize how sad it essentially was. She has aged so incredibly, said Maman. I watched her coming and going, and I became aware of it all at once. It's curious. Apparently we don't notice from day to day or from year to year that our parents are growing old. Then suddenly we find ourselves before the irreparable. Then, because her mother had grown old, Maman herself looked a great deal older, and began to cry. It was strange, though. In order to make us see how old her mother had become, Maman needed first, it seemed, to make us see her as she'd been when she was young. You know that she was considered a very beautiful woman in her time. No, we hadn't known. With sparkling eyes and abundant jet-black hair, and such a carriage! And her memory, too, just like her drawers, beautifully tidy, in perfect order. Dates, names, every event in its place. She was a remarkable person, said Maman. And now? I asked, thinking chiefly of the drawers. Let me give you an example, said Maman. Twice in the same day she asked me what year I was born, and how old that made me. I did not find this so shocking, doubtless because grandmother had so often had to ask me too, how old are you? Even my name, which I must admit had disconcerted me a little. The thing that confounded me most was Maman herself. The way her face changed, becoming sad and tender when she spoke of grandmother when she was young, then only sad and despondent. I could make almost nothing more of this coming and going of one human being through the memory of another. A grandmother who was old and who might perhaps grow a little older, I could admit, but a grandmother with a brisk step, fiery eyes, and thick black hair, I could not. I suppose I must have believed that grandmother had always been old. Maman had come to the moment in her story when she had been obliged to part from grandmother, reluctant to leave her alone but not knowing what else she could do. As stubborn as ever, her mother declared that she wasn't ready yet to give up her own concerns, her independence. It was as if she believed herself assured of 10 years of life still to come. Or perhaps she knew this wasn't so, and simply wished to make use of whatever time might remain to her in her own way. And I, Maman asked us, can I be in 2 places at once, here where I'm needed, and there where I may be needed quite as much? No, we told Maman to console her. No one can be in 2 places at once. She thanked us with a smile. The thing that kept gnawing at her, she admitted, was a sense that she had been close to victory over ma mère. I was on the doorstep, you understand. I was slipping on my gloves. It was a grey, lifeless morning. You know what the countryside is like there in the early spring. Almost as bare as in the fall. You can scarcely believe it will ever come to life again. I could have sworn at that moment that if I could have just found the right word. The axe quivered, I do believe. But then a flock of migrating birds passed across the sky and your grandmother lifted her head. That was the chief thing I had to contend with, that wretched springtime, the little seeds she had entrusted to the earth, her savory, her petunias that were just about to come up, she said. Even so, she felt a certain fear at seeing me go. You'll come back soon? She asked. Yes, Maman, but you mustn't be stubborn for too long. One of these days, you'll have to come. We'll see, she said, doing her best to hide her vertigo and dizziness. From the threshold, she looked ahead of her at the naked prairie, about which she has complained so bitterly all her life, saying that it wearied her to death, and that she would never get used to it, that it would never be her country. And yet, I wonder if it isn't that same prairie that holds her there so strongly today, her old enemy, or what she believed was her enemy. From my point of view, it seemed that the very next day it was a lovely autumn. It didn't sadden me at that time. The days were short and often somber, but we kept a good fire going in the house. We ate pumpkin pie, we sorted walnuts and corn. We also set tomatoes to ripen on the windowsills, and on certain days the whole house was permeated with the odor of pickles cooking over a gentle fire in large pans. The saw could be heard singing in the yard its two-toned song, first clear, then deeper and heavier as it bit into the wood. It seemed to me to promise us joyfully, I'm cutting you fine logs for the whole winter. All this time the house, like a ship ready to weigh anchor or a city about to undergo siege, was being filled with provisions. Sauerkraut, maple syrup from Quebec, red apples from British Columbia, plums from Ontario. Soon, also, we began to receive from our uncles in the country fat geese and turkeys, dozens of chickens, ham, and salt bacon, cases of fresh eggs and farm butter. To help ourselves, we had only to go into our summer kitchen, now transformed into a storehouse, where the frost preserved our stock. Such were the joys of autumn, based upon abundance and a feeling of security that I think I appreciated even then. But Maman, who had also always greatly loved the autumn, this year, as she devoted herself to the occupations it demanded, seemed to do so grudgingly. She gathered things in, it might be said, without joy, and even with a sort of sorrow, all the time close in spirit to her mother. She too, she said, will have brought in her cucumbers and squash. She too will have preserved as much as possible. But for what purpose? Poor old woman. What will be the use to her of all that work? and the idea grazed me lightly that it must indeed be heartbreaking to have one's cupboards full, one's pantry stuffed to the bursting point, one's cellar perfumed with great cabbages, gooseberry jam on the shelves, things to eat everywhere, and no longer anyone to offer them to. The days grew even shorter, and this was increasingly to my taste. Like all the children in that part of the world, I longed for snow. I dreamed that it had come down during my sleep in swift flakes, preparing that beautiful pure white world that I believed I loved best, though when it melted with the coming of spring into 1,000 restless little streams, this too I believe I loved above everything else. One morning, Maman, who had also always loved the winter, as she loved the other seasons, began to lament as she looked out the slightly frosted window. Winter already! How sad that is! And she set out before the day was over to go, as she put it, to give yet one more shake to the tree. 2 days later the weather was bad, wonderfully bad, I should say, for I loved to see the snow puff up and rise and wander high in the sky in ceaselessly changing shapes that might even be half alive, for I believed I could hear them shouting with happiness at being finally set free by the storm. Then, as I stood at the window fascinated by this dance of the snow, I saw at the end of the street a rather old woman helping another who was much older down from a streetcar, both of them somberly dressed, the younger of the two carrying a suitcase and an ancient umbrella. I shall never be able to forget how black the figures of my mother and her mother looked that evening, against the uniform whiteness of the landscape. The moment she had helped her mother take off her bonnet and cloak, right till the end grandmother continued to have a different vocabulary from ours, Maman led her to a big old chair that she had upholstered and forbidden us to sit in, before ma mère even arrived at our house. That will be her chair, she would say. At least leave her her chair. Grandmother, however, did not seem as pleased as Maman had hoped. Do you think I want to spend my life sitting down now? She asked. Why, no, said Maman. You will come and go. You'll make yourself perfectly at home. At home, Grandmother replied, looking about her with displeasure. Don't fancy that I'm going to drag on here forever. The thing that astonished us most from this day on was Maman's attitude. After having stood up to her mother till that time, she now almost always agreed with her. You will stay only as long as you wish, Maman. But she told us privately that while Grandmother was packing her suitcase, she had, quite casually, slipped her booty into the bottom. By her booty, Grandmother meant her finest underwear and bed linen, which she had been working at for a good part of her life, and which she was saving, she always said, for a time to come. What time could this be? And why did Grandmother putting off using her booty till so late? But it is true, the old women of those days did nothing as we do today. Winter was so delightful to me at the time, and I had so much to do, building forts or making hills of snow and sliding down them on my sleigh, a pastime I was able to continue almost till nightfall, for I had a lantern made of a candle in an old jam tin with a slit in it attached to the front of my sleigh to light my way. So much to do, that I scarcely noticed what was happening to Grandmother from one day to the next. I would come in, my cheeks reddened from the cold, my eyes sparkling, excited by my games, and I would see, huddled at the end of the kitchen, an aged person whose eyes followed all our comings and goings with a strange expression. I couldn't rid myself of the notion that it was not my real grandmother Maman had brought to our house that snowy evening. She must have made a mistake and brought someone else, for my real grandmother would never have been able to remain idle. She had always said it would kill her to sit about with nothing to do. But one day she grew angry and demanded some work. Some work, said Maman. Haven't you done enough in your life? But just the same she gave her a few towels to hem. And the old woman who lived among us in her corner began to examine the fabric, testing its resistance by pulling it from all sides, only to declare at last that it was far from being as good as that she had woven in her time. She was continually feeling material now, the material of our clothes and curtains and household linen. She made fun of it, saying it was nothing but trash. To hear her speak, everything in our house was cheap store-bought trash. Sometimes, at certain words, I pricked up my ears, believing that I had recognized for a moment the voice of my grandmother. But immediately afterward there would be only a mumble, and I had returned to my idea of the substitution of persons. The towels made scarcely any progress, and the old person in our house got it into her head that she would rather knit some heavy black stockings of a sort, moreover, that almost no one wore any more. When she reached the heel, the whole thing became muddled up, and she scolded away about the wool of today that didn't knit up well. Maman, in secret, partly unraveled the stocking, and redid it to the place where her mother had stopped. Grandmother noticed just the same, and complained that the goblins must have tangled her wool during the night. I was astonished by this, having myself stopped believing in goblins a long time before. Maman explained that this was a belief from the time of grandmother's childhood, and that such beliefs had a tendency to be reborn in extreme old age. No doubt it was this that muddled me up in my turn, that in grandmother's case one spoke at once of old age and of second childhood. I was still not more than half persuaded that it was really she who lived with us, but I began to study her from closer at hand. At that time, scarcely anything remained to her but speech, if speech it could be called. Maman claimed, however, that we did not make enough effort to listen to grandmother, and that later we might be sorry we hadn't gathered in the last confidences of a life, that these were a sort of an inestimable treasure that was offered only rarely in the course of an existence. One day, when they believed themselves alone together, I listened to them sharing this treasure, and all I heard was this. Maman, when one reaches your age, Maman, what does life seem to be? Grandmother, a dream, my daughter. Not much more than a dream. Another day, when Maman had interrupted her work to go sit beside grandmother and try to make out what she was saying by following the movement of her lips, she flung us a look at once melancholy and triumphant. Do you know what she's just said to me? For it was as if grandmother needed her now to interpret her words to us, and no one was better in this role than Maman. She said, Evelyn, do you remember the little Assomption River? The Assomption River? What river was this of which I was hearing for the first time in my life? It's a little river in the hills where she was born, Maman explained. I didn't know she had thought of it so much, but do try to understand. The Assomption River is a little of your grandmother's youth, far away in Quebec. What was there to understand? The Assomption River I could manage to picture a little. A pretty and capricious river, I was told, that flowed swiftly at times, then suddenly took its own time to idle into coves. But those other things, the frank speech, the courage, the piercing sight, where were all these things that had once belonged to grandmother, as Maman said, and how could she have let them be lost? I played with less spirit now. Often I came back to the house for nothing, simply to see what was happening and to give a glance at the aged person who was losing more all the time. We had got into the way, I don't know how, of speaking of her while she was still present. Maman begged us to be careful. Perhaps she still hears us. Her looks follow us in any event, and perhaps she's accusing us. One evening, when Maman was helping her into bed, her mother seized her by the hand and drew her close and lamented into her ear. Not good for anything anymore. Just a nuisance. Want to go away. You want to go away? Certainly, Maman. Someday very soon we'll go away. We'll all go. Was this really my grandmother, whom one day in my childish naivete I had believed to be like God? Or one of his best helpers at least, occupied every day of her busy life providing on earth for human needs? I was beginning to understand that no one was almighty except him, and then why did he need, as Maman said, to reduce us sometimes to total impotence? My hard-working grandmother lay paralyzed from head to foot, only her eyes still alive. At least, Maman insisted that they were. I'm sure she's still conscious, he said. Poor soul, we must try to reach her again. She was the only one who discovered the way. She would stay close to this immobile block under the covers that she continued to call Maman, and I cannot describe the derangement I experienced to hearing my mother, old as she seemed to me at that time, speaking with this child's word to someone who could no longer eat or drink alone. I felt such an unutterable confusion about ages, about childhood and old age, that it seemed to me I would never get myself out of it. It was rather as if Maman were taking care of a baby. But does one ask a baby, does one say to it, your conscience is clear, isn't it? You've always done your duty. Why should you fear? From time to time she would become aware of me, always at her skirts, as if her task were not complicated enough without that, and she would try to send me away, but gently. Go outside. Go and play. And I would see her eyes fill with pity, for me as well as for Mamère. For everyone, perhaps, as if Maman had taken everyone in the world into her pity, and to me also at that time everyone must have seemed in need of pity. She seldom succeeded in sending me away. I was drawn, far more than by my usual games, by this other sort of game in which my mother seemed to be engaged, seated near her own mother and interrogating her, a strange game of questions to which there were very seldom answers. Won't you eat a little? Some good chicken broth I've made, especially for you. At times the eyes closed. I myself believed it was in weariness from all these questions, but according to Maman it meant yes, and she would hurry, pleased, she said, at still being able to do something for someone who had done so much for her. Most often, though, the eyes remained fixed. And so far from us, Maman would be grief-stricken. Yet there must be something that she wishes. But what? Something that she wishes, I said to myself in my turn. What could someone wish for who had nothing more to lose but her eyes? To look at something, probably. But what? One day, when I was passing the room in which grandmother lay, quite alone for the moment, I went in timidly. At first I kept far from the bed, looking elsewhere at the beautiful lace curtains, for instance, that Maman had recently and at long last taken from her drawers. They were thrifty women, she and my grandmother. They put off using their booty, it seemed to me, until too late. Finally, I risked a glance from the side of grandmother's bed. I met her eyes. They were of a living brown, still beautiful, and they seemed to be asking me to come closer. I think it was at this moment that I finally surrendered to the truth that this was my grandmother. I drew closer. I whispered as if I still weren't entirely sure, or perhaps because I was a little bit afraid. Mère. I thought of asking, as Maman did, "Are you hungry? Are you thirsty?" But it soon occurred to me that Mère couldn't care very much for this, and that her wishes, if she still had any, must be for something quite different. It may have been because Maman, at the time when her mother was resisting her, had spoken so often of going to give a shake to the tree, but grandmother at this moment really made me think of a poor old oak, isolated from the others, alone on a little hill. Perhaps this was the source of another curious idea, which has remained with me, that trees also have a grievance in a sense. Enclosed in their tough bark, their feet held fast in the earth, unable to go away if they wish. Though who can come and go as he desires? I dreamed, seated in my turn beside grandmother, dreamed about trees, I think. Then an odd picture came to me. I seemed to see, lower down, some young trees which were perhaps born of the old tree on the hillside, but still decked in all their leaves, sang in the valley. It was this image, I believe, that gave me a most brilliant idea. I ran down to the living room to fetch the photograph album. It was a big, bulky book, bound in green velvet with gold clasps. I went up again, the book pressed against my chest. I sat down beside the bed, and I turned the pages. On almost every one of them I came upon someone who was, as the expression goes, descended from Mère. I went over and held the book before her eyes. "You have lots of folks of your own, eh?" I said. "Look, Mère." Then, remembering that when I had visited her 2 years before, she had already had difficulty finding her way among her grandchildren, I began to call off their names, coupling each one when I could with a face in the album. In this way, it seemed to me, grandmother would be able to gather once more into her mind all those who belonged to her. It was a fine pastime, and I set myself to it with ardor. I hoped to forget no one, and especially to reach 100, a figure I respected enormously at that time. But would I reach it? Perhaps, if I counted the dead, but it had won the right to in a list such as I was making. It seemed to me that one hadn't. I didn't know what death was. To my mind, it was a simple matter of disappearance. One day people were there, another day they were not. Besides, among the dead people in the album there were some I hadn't even known. Was it worth mentioning them? And yet the more names I had to offer Mère, it seemed to me the more enclosed she would feel. And so it came about that, as I turned the pages, I found her there herself, still young, seated beside her husband, among her children, some of them standing behind her, the younger ones on the grass at her feet. This old photograph fascinated me so much that I forgot everything else. Through it, at last, I think I began to understand vaguely a little about life, and all the successive beings it makes of us as we increase in age. I raised my eyes from the album, and compared the photograph with the original. There was not much resemblance. I came, with the book open at that page, to show my grandmother the portrait she no longer resembled. "You were beautiful in those days," I said. Did her eyes not sparkle a little? Perhaps. But at that moment I noticed Maman in the doorway. She had come up without a sound and must have been standing there motionless, for a moment, watching and listening to me. She gave me a sad and very tender little smile. But why did she look so pleased with me? I was only playing, as she herself had taught me to do, as Mère also had played with me one day. As we all play, perhaps, throughout our lives, at trying to catch up with one another. Alright, that was the first chapter. Those last couple sentences really almost brought a tear to my eyes. But I hope you enjoyed listening. This is my first sort of narrative expedition that I've undertaken. It's not something I've done before. So expect some audio complications, I suppose. Please let me know in the comments if you have any like tips or tricks for how to improve audio quality. Or just how to get like a better sound. Currently I'm running, I think it's a Shure MV7 microphone. But I don't have any like soundproofing or anything of the sort. So it is just like me, my microphone, and then my computer just blaring away in the background. Plus all the little like minute sounds that I'm, turning the pages and brushing up against the microphone. So if you have any tips for how to, I guess, sort of negate those, I would really appreciate hearing about those in the comments. Or just if you had something to say about the text, how it made you feel. I know I might maybe do a retrospective on the book when it's finished, just to offer some insights and how it relates, I think, to my own life, and just some like general sort of thoughts. And you can't stop me because this is my channel. Anyway, thank you for listening. Leave a like, subscribe, comment, etc. And enjoy your doom scrolling.